So, dear guests, welcome to the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study into the 7th Wittrock Lecture. And I am very happy to see so many of you here today. And before we kick the lecture off, let me inform you about some logistical, but nevertheless very important details. In case we need them, and I hope not, the fire escape routes are at the back of this hall and at the front from your end, from where you just entered. And the restrooms are located in the basement underneath us. And our photographer, Mikael Wallerstedt, will walk around to take pictures. And if you don't want to appear on those, please let him know. Coffee and tea will be served at 3 o'clock in the Linneanum, right across the entrance to this hall, on the first floor and on the second floor. And of course, the weather also invites us to go out into the early spring garden. So, the Wittrock Lecture series is arranged annually by us here at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study. And we see these lectures as an opportunity for us to open our doors to a broader audience and to engage in state-of-the-art discussions around a topic chosen by a stellar scholar. The lecture series has come to address complex challenges facing our contemporary society, from the very shifting nature of globalization to crisis in democracy to the future of governance and indeed human civilization. And the Wittrock Lecture series was launched in 2019 in honor of the contributions of Professor Björn Wittrock, who's honoring us today with his presence, as always. And as principal of SCAS in the years 1996 to 2018, and its driving force ever since the creation of SCAS in 1985, Björn has contributed significantly to the strong position of this institute as an internationally, I may say, renowned institute for advanced study. And not least, he has contributed to the advancement of the social sciences and the humanities in Sweden, in Europe, and beyond. And through his research, he has contributed to also the advancement of the sociology of ancient, medieval, and modern societies, to global history, intellectual history, and to civilizational analysis. And speaking of civilization, our civilization, as we know it today, is one fraught with tensions, tribalism, and divisions. Populistic notions of belonging and community push us in the direction of distancing and enmity. Illiberal democracies across the world are now routinely ignoring constitutional limits on their power and depriving their citizens of basic rights and freedoms. And faced with this troubling global predicament, there is all the more reason to stop and reflect critically on the lived experiences of these predicaments, the forces that push the world in this direction, and whether there might be the case that other alternative minds, actions, and futurities are conceivable. And in this context, I am happy, I'm delighted and honored to present today's speaker, Emeritus 1931 Professor of Geography and Fellow of Christ's College, University of Cambridge, Ash Amin. Ash has a remarkable career, if I may say so, with a consistent line of inquiry. His work in urban, cultural, and economic geography is on globalization as an everyday process and experience, the economy as cultural entity, race and multiculture at the intersection of biopolitics and vernacular practices, slums and dwelling practices, cities and regions as relationally constituted. And after earning his PhD in geography at Reading University in 1986, he spent a number of years at Newcastle University, where he also became lecturer and professor. He moved on to Durham University, where he was professor of geography and later also founding executive director of the Institute of Advanced Study there. And he has held fellowships and visiting professorships at a number of European universities. I'm proud to say that Ash is an honorary doctor of Uppsala University and was also awarded the 2021 Olof Palme Visiting Professorship by the Swedish Research Council, held here at Uppsala University. He's previously been a SCAS Fellow, and now we are proud to have him as a member of our academic senate. Previously Foreign Secretary of the British Academy, he is currently a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation. He was awarded a CBE, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire in 2014 for his contributions to social science. And in his latest book, which bears the title After Nativism, Belonging in an Age of Intolerance, Ash does offer a brighter way forward. There is ground, he argues, for progressives to mount a culture aesthetics of belonging that will convince the discontents of neoliberal globalization that there is a better alternative to nativist politics. He proposes a relational politics of belonging premised on the encounter, public interest politics, collaboration over common existential threats, and daily collectives and infrastructures of well-being. And the flyer for this book is at your disposal here, so you may pick it up at your convenience. Now, with 5 other fellows of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Program Humanities Urban Future, he is working on a book on urban foreclosure and its foreshadows. And this brings us to the topic of today's lecture, Future Foreclosed, Urban Time and the Politics of Urban Incipience. Warmly welcome, Ash.
Thank you. Christina, thank you very much for your warm words. I don't quite recognize the person you were describing. It's wonderful coming back to SCAS. It feels like coming home, and meeting some of my old friends at lunch confirmed to me that, SCAS has a place somewhere in my heart. And I have to say that it's a great privilege to have been asked to do this lecture. I was slightly reticent in the beginning to say yes because of how prestigious it is. But it is a special privilege because of the name of the lecture. Firstly, I want to this gives me a chance to thank Bjorn Wittrock for the many, many opportunities he's given me over the last 25 years at SCAS and beyond. So Bjorn, I owe you one, and this is a response. But above all, I think it's a privilege because in Bjorn we recognize really the brilliance of, firstly, the progenitor of this very special and renowned collegium. This collegium is what it is because of Bjorn, there's no doubt about that. But also because I think it gives me a chance to say in public, and Christina said this already, that here we have a social scientist of the first order. Just look at his contributions on the role of universities, on the history of the social sciences, on the axial age, on multiple modernities. Over the years, whether if it's his work on China or dipping his toe into African civilizations, contributions on early Afro-Eurasian crystallizations. I have to say, Bjorn's work, and you will all recognize this, has been consequential in all sorts of ways. And I just hope that I can do justice to his name in this lecture. So my talk is about cities, and I think it is fair to say that cities now find themselves on the front line of the dangers of climate change, diverse plethora of emergencies, failing infrastructures, biased authority, and prolonged austerity. And this is especially so for their unprotected populations, who in very large numbers, some billions I would say, face today only precarity and uncertainty. Their future seems foreclosed. A horizon of receding hope and receding security, and a horizon of confinement to the present of self-help to negotiate the dangers that I've just listed. Their options seem to rest on what they can muster, what they can bring into being in a condition of dispossession. And if this is true, then do we need to better understand the ecologies of life in the city where that life has become remaindered, where it's become residual? Where in these ecologies of remaindered life, all we have are trickster habits and trickster engagements with the future. And this question that I've just posed is a question that I am working on with a group of us that Christina mentioned within a multi-annual program funded by the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research, CIFA, called Humanity's Urban Future. And what we're doing is we're looking at the habits that are learned in conditions of duress within threadbare, very desperate neighborhoods in Mexico City, in Naples, in Kinshasa, and Lagos, but also with a lot of conceptual rethinking. And what we're looking at is the practices of make-shift, make-shift. Practices of make-shift in the foreshadows of planned time, technicities of co-produced infrastructures, and ethics of care that are formed in foregoing. All these words I shall return to. And what we find in our work, in these case studies, in the rethinking we're doing, is what I choose to call a double blackness of subjugation on the one hand, but also a certain waywardness in subjugation, which echoes the writing on plantation legacies in America, but this time formed in practices of making the unlivable habitable. Let's see if it works. It works. So in these practices, the engagement with time seems different. Somehow anachronistic, resembling Giorgio Agamben's description of the contemporary or contemporariness as something not simply taking place in chronological time, but, as the citation says, working within chronological time, something that urges, presses, and transforms it. And he calls this urgency the untimeliness the anachronism that permits us to grasp our time in the form of a too soon that is also too late, of an already that is also a not yet. Moreover, he says, it allows us to recognize, and this is really important, in the obscurity of the present, a light that, without ever being able to reach us, is perpetually voyaging towards us. It's an amazing citation, this, which kind of frames my lecture today. So what I want to do today is just to dwell a moment on this caesura of his analysis, his interpretation of time, to ask about what might be opened by thinking urban time in this way, not just time in general, but the time of the city, and whether it is possible to give the orientations of remaindered life more traction against contemporary moves of urban foreclosure. Now, it's common in urban historiography to think of cities as palimpsests of past layers of form worked into the present. Here, rather like the ancient reuse of scraped papyrus with old markings that are still faintly visible, cities are seen to gather remnants from the past, evident in ruins, excavations, reconstructions, cartographic overlays. These remnants, what are they? The remnants are sites of memory, signs of legacy, the archaeological record on which the new unfolds, always warning against thinking and planning the city as a tabula rasa. The notion of the palimpsestic city shows cities to be stratified, that the contemporary is stratified, that past layers are either concealed or reworked into the present, are ever there, as we find obviously in cities like Uppsala, but also some of the more evidently historic cities such as Istanbul and Rome, which prompts one historian, Nadia Bartolini, to suggest that instead of the palimpsestic analogy, we might want to think about their past as braciated. Braciated is a term from geology which captures urban process as the fusion of many past built forms, many past technologies, and many organizational practices. In other words, the urban history is not just one of layering of things that disappear, but the coming together of things from the past. They're melding together to produce the future and, of course, obviously, the present. So here the notion is that there is temporal seepage. Now, whichever the better descriptor of urban chronicity, whether it is palimpsestic or combinatorial, the history of city making, isn't it interesting, is riddled. It's brimful of clean slate vanities. In our own times, preparations for tough time ahead through algorithmic intelligence are a very good example. In the cities of the north, computational dives into mass data to simulate future trends and to spot developments are driving city plans now on how to organize, where to position, and what to avoid or to cultivate. In the algorithmic city, the premise on the future is synchronicity, sensing diachronicity to be superseded by simultaneous time-space interactions which rather behave like neural networks. Algorithmic planning today, which in a sense, is the zeitgeist of urban planning across the global north, algorithmic planning today sees only a ceaseless present of emergent developments prompted by technological accelerations, environmental tipping points, pandemics and wars, and of course, real-time global interactions. It is then held which require a technoscience of lateral scan and anticipation. The smart city, able to capture mass data, to simulate trends and possibilities, to forge the future from the emergent present, and only the emergent present. Nothing of the past. The past is remaindered. But what's really interesting here is that the noise of the remaindered, whether it is the past or people and places that have been left behind, the noise of the remaindered does not go away, because it is what makes cities what they are. These cities are densities of past fabrications, arrivals from everywhere, intersections of multiple temporalities. Cities are amalgams of difference, excess, and overflow in their interactions, making time and space, altering but never eliminating the remaindered, whether it is historical or people and place. Their chronicity is durational, not in the sense of a continuing sameness, but as Bergson intended, I think, when he wrote of lived and historical time as, and I quote, succession without absolute distinction, and which later Gilles Deleuze intended, I think, as, I quote, the eternal present of immanent forces of recursion and instantiation, of course, always in changed circumstances. And this is slightly abstract, but we can get to it, I think, through a brilliant allegory of this chronicity in Italo Calvino's novel, Invisible Cities, when in it Marco Polo describes to Kublai Khan how the cities he has seen on his travels present their past visibly, I quote from Calvino, like the lines of a hand written in the corners of the street, the gratings of the windows, the banisters of the steps, the antennae of the lighting rods, the poles of the flags, and so on. And I think in this imagery, Marco Polo is asking us, or asking Kublai Khan, to see life in these fictitious cities in utopia, forever moving up and down like on a chessboard. Bodies in Adelma embodying the living and the dead, hence the quote right at the beginning of this lecture. In Clarice, splendor incorporating past destruction. In Leonia, debris always flooding back from the outskirts. And in Landomia, the dead, living and unborn, and this is unbelievable, jammed in the pores of stones. He says to Kublai Khan, "This is what I saw in my travels." Of course, it's fiction, but it's not really. And similarly, though less allegorically, I think Walter Benjamin writes of the arrival of the modern in Paris or Berlin or in Moscow in terms of the future perfect tense. And he uses the future perfect tense essentially to show the continuities of urban form and also urban vernacular, bending what he called the thought images of newness, the thought images of clearance intended by the Paris arcades, the glass towers of modernist architecture, and Soviet experimental films after the October Revolution. Here too, the inexhaustible porosities, his words, of Naples, blending tradition and modernity. So in these modernizing cities, he found, oddly enough, Naples. Okay? This constant play between tradition and modernity. So what am I getting at here? To recognize urban durational time, I think, is to bring into view power embedded in the secretions of property, techne, and authority. It is to recognize the continuities of life in the surrounds, despite the plans intended of erasure. It's to recognize the multiple past presence of different places and communities, the developments that knowingly or unknowingly incorporate material from the past. It's to see how the bends of time interfere with the singularities of orderly progression and newness out of nowhere. I think we begin to understand why Agamben speaks of the contemporary, therefore, as untimely, and its play of shadow and light as no predictor of what comes next. We see a future made in the tensions of rulings, but also artful practices that inexhaustible reservoir of experiences, ideas, and objects that bear witness, as Ernst Bloch wrote in relation to hope's residues. So, what I think this reading of Urban Time gives us is a key to look past contemporary trends of urban foreclosure, to return to where I started. A quick resume here. In the global north, the very short-lived era of urban planning for generalized well-being is faltering, having long eluded cities, as we know, of the majority world. Universalist projects, whether the utopian dreams of planners and architects or the housing, infrastructural and welfare projects of democratic authorities, are under strain. In part, this is because cities everywhere are being scarred by major existential challenges, exacerbating older patterns of urban inequality and division. And so today, unprotected urban majorities and minorities are facing the entwined, the mangled hazards of disease, climate change, broken markets, warfare, exhausted staples, and creaking infrastructures, and also creaking governance or biased governance systems. So a new logic of existential risk is making the survival of majorities everywhere in the world a lottery, an end without means. An enduring condition, at least in the south, of urban populations having to live with disease, want, and war, dare I say, is becoming the new norm. As the urban machinery providing shelter, staples, and security unravels from its overexposure. But here I think there's also another dimension of urban inoperability, which is the capture of this machinery by the powerful to negotiate this foreboding horizon. What we see today unfolding is a biopolitics of urban of urban repossession, which lies at the heart of this response, manifest in the grab of urban assets by economic and political elites to harness possibility in the volatile future for themselves and their kind, to protect themselves from the insurrections of the dispossessed. So to older repertoires of surveillance and marginalization of the poor, today, at least in the mainstream, are being added new maneuvers to make and claim urban value through deprivations of land and property, the commodification of everything, algorithmic smartness, the reclaim of public institutions, services and infrastructures, and also the very capture of immanent potential. An urban time of power allowing majorities access to the city and marginals to lead their own lives, I think is giving way to a time of reappropriation of the operative landscape. The logic is anticipatory, looking to instrumentalize urban immanence as well as to neuter dangerous excess. With developers, investors, and public authorities increasingly working together to raise and remake popular neighborhoods in which residents have made the future through everyday inhabitation. These moves threaten the untimeliness of the contemporary that Agamben speaks of. The already and not yet of anticipation formed in inhabiting lack, where interactions with familiar strangers, practiced informalities and improvisations, technicities of make-shift, and intimacies of place help residents to make something out of nothing. I think this threat is very real. It's truly consequential if it comes to pass. And yet, we also know from the history of urban encroachment that it is a history of flaws and of remainders. The attempts to command and control, never quite take in everything, are often vigorously resisted. They come with inefficiencies and blunders, and they almost always fall short of snuffing out, of killing off the life world. This much is clear from the copious ethnographies of popular neighborhoods and informal settlements in cities of the South and in the poor urban neighborhoods of northern cities, which attest to practices of survival based on what I might call surface scanning and surface attunement, which I will now make clear what I mean by that. We might call these practices of incipience, of beginnings arising from the constant adjustments in lack, constant adjustments in deprivation. As Abdul Malik Simon explains in a preamble paper to our book, places are marked by enduring traces of prolonged trauma and vitality, whose residual reverberations are slow to dissipate. And in quoting Ewen Zor, he says, an incontinence of memory, what a beautiful phrase, an incontinence of memory populates every domain with its menagerie of ghosts, demons, and spirits, all of which provide an invisible yet material backdrop to what disparate people might do with each other. Between the stabilizations secured through bloodshed and the curiosity-driven outward movements is an intricate architecture of both ethical and strategic decisions. How much is to be shown or said? How vulnerable is one to be in the face of uncertain prospects? What responsibility does one take for the life of others? Far or near, what are these relative distances? These are conundrums addressed every day. These are examples of agency. And I think this is especially so in popular neighborhoods with their unprogrammed ways of articulation and their surfaces of contact and exploration that bring place, situations, and actors into a kind of generative proximity. Simone, again, it is the intricacies of the surface, its textures, angles, trajectories, if you like, the built environment, that lead residents into specific scenarios and not others, but which are also the medium through which the encounters and the domain in which they occur are both constituted. This is a really key phrase, that what you do is a product of your engagement with territory, with place, with ecology. It's that ecology of relationship that produces you, your subjectivity, but also your forms of agency. Here the future performs in people's knowledge about what is to come, whether it'll rain tomorrow, how to modify your itinerary when infrastructure fails, whether water will come out of the tap, whether an earthquake is coming. Tomorrow, remember this lecture is partly on time, tomorrow is anticipated in enduring instincts of riding the surface amidst all forms of trauma, including contemporary acts of dispossession. It's the daily fabric of place and its inhabitation that form the plane of existence, a perennial call and response, carrying the present into the future, prompting what next step to take, whose outcome, of course, can never be known. So the demands of the near horizon are addressed, what I'm arguing, are addressed in inhabited time and through the materials at hand. And the horizon of the foreclosed future is kind of pragmatically blunted, somehow domesticated, but never without any degree of certainty of success. So I think what follows from this line of thinking, let's call it, the pressing political question, I think, that's raised by today's composite foreclosures, the ones that I mentioned, is not whether the city of residues will disappear and whether urban time will become singular, but whether the practices of surfacing in popular neighborhoods, in the way that I've described them, can remain capriciously generative as they get sacrificed to power's encroachments. What will remain of their waywardness when their fabric, the living fabric, is cleansed and commodified and vilified, when the surface of proximate associations is broken? What scope is there for a politics of the remaindered ecology as being prefigurative of another urbanism? Now, in many ways, this last question is one of political aesthetics, of how different projections of the urban good life can find traction. In the history of urban planning, let's not forget, it has been the stock trade of city makers to lodge their visions and plans in the public imagination, to make them seem necessary, desirable, healthy. It is not as though today's moves of algorithmic intelligence, urban clearances, financialization of the real estate, and endless rolling out of iconic buildings lack public endorsement. All these things have public endorsement. They come with popular complicity, secured through an aesthetic machinery of graphics of trends, scenarios of inevitability, dramas of consequence, and imagery of foreclosure as opening. So, against these big moves of public capture, can neighborhood culture, caught in the form of graffiti or popular music or rough art or youth theatre or craft enterprise, could any of this make any difference or any impact whatsoever? How could these expressions possibly enunciate another urban future, and without romanticizing the disfigurations of life in the hood? The power asymmetry is glaring, yet it could be argued, which is what I want to argue, that the very absence in the mainstream of a counter-aesthetic to that of foreclosure, at the very least provides reason for existing restive practices in the hood, in popular neighborhoods, to be made visible, at the very least, because there's nothing else. I think that's part of my argument. So this could begin with the charisma, if you like, of the thought image, to go back to Benjamin. Philippe de Buc, one of the co-authors of our book, has long worked with the photographer Sami Balogi to mix images and lexical openings that encapsulate the ways in which Kinshasa's overwhelmingly poor population jostles for possibility in conditions of adversity and lack. In his work with Sami, the overlays of close description, arresting imagery, ground vernaculars of survival, emerge portraits of the foraging inventions, the studied collaborations, the popular fabulations that enable the city's residents in duress to look for a way forward and to invest their, however impossible, lives with meaning. Philippe's films, books, and exhibitions bring to the surface, in my view, existential ploys and rationalities yet to be written into the urban grammar. Forms of regrouping, reprise is the word he uses, in suffering that could add texture to an urban counterpolitics that draws on existing sensibilities of care in conditions of denial. And then I think there are also street technicities to be made visible, as Tatiana Thiem shows in her new book on youth hustle in Matari, Nairobi's largest informal settlement, Nairobi, where I grew up, the site of so many doomsday accounts of slum life. What Thiem does in this book, which is about to come out, she finds art forms in the slum facilitated by inexpensive digital technologies that narrate the hood differently, that seek to place its creative waywardness in public culture. She writes of how local tours are organized by youth collectives and street corner performances, and videos of musical and craft creativity in the social media as aesthetic products that perform virtue, but without denying Mathari's long history of violence and abjection. She says here the intent is deliberate by these kids, looking to make hustling look good and easy, an affirmation of life, play, I quote, and joyful militancy amidst backdrops of breakdown and harm, end quote. What interests me in this example is not so much the virtuosity of the hustle economy, but how Matari exemplifies countless similar expressions of pushback in popular neighborhoods around the world. And here just a little bit of light and entertainment.
Tulipatana Instagram, akanifollow TikTok, tukaanza kusnapchat, akanieka status yake WhatsApp. Tulipatana Instagram, akanifollow TikTok, tukaanza kusnapchat, akanieka status yake WhatsApp.
Mambo bre, nimecheki video zako kwa Insta.
Siko baya kerehere, peleka huko kwa Twitter.
Siezi sare kukufuata, nitakufollow hadi TikTok.
Wenda kublog, manze una comment mpaka kwa picha.
Unabongaje kwani you don't know me dear?
Wepiga tika umepita, staki umama kwa media.
Jagudi mogothi ni sachu kipitia.
Unadi haya njeri.
Okay, you get the sense of it. And you know, these are works of art produced from Matari, Nairobi's biggest slum, and they come into the public arena. They're made visibly public, they're made attractive, and they have a massive, massive following. So here are simply 3 examples of what I would call a political aesthetics of urban surfacing, of urban resurfacing. And there are many, many more that could be scooped up by collaborations between communities, artists, and activists presenting another urban narrative. In China Miéville's suggestive turn of phrase, this is a narrative of, I quote, future cities that retcon the ones which we have now into worthy foundations. It's where we could propose the alleyway, as it was once proposed, as a barricade, by a mimetic and reparative build, vernacular intelligence, repurposed artifacts in the way of rap with the turntable, or situationism did with the map, so that it becomes viable to write and read meaning out of contingency. So I had a third example which I was going to talk about, but because of the economy of time, I'll skip that one and I'll carry on. But while such an aesthetics of contingency might help to make the case for another urbanism, it's not going to feed mouths. I mean, we can be clear about that. There are countless urban margins of social life which are stripped bare because of acute lack. Desolate high-rises, faraway slums, abandoned neighborhoods, temporary encampments that turn out to be permanent, desolate suburbs. Here, the fabric of place, the social connections, the place affordances, the cobbled infrastructures barely exist, are threadbare. And there is little togetherness in contingency. The social instinct in these places is to flee in body and mind. And if abjection doesn't overwhelm, to go with the tricksters, mobsters, and gangs that provide very small crumbs in return, to dig deep into the inner self and intimate others for some form of fleeting comfort. I've seen a lot of this kind of social existence in my work on slums, whether they're in Cape Town or in Delhi or in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. Here, the survivors are just too broken, really, to help each other, and their instincts of surfacing unable to offer anything tangible that lasts. I'm trying to... Okay, this is this example that I skipped. So, elsewhere in localities that have experienced sustained economic decline, we find a pathology of nostalgia that impedes social agency. In the first example that I gave, the pathology is of desperation and complete isolation. In these places, that once had economic prosperity, we have a pathology of nostalgia that impedes social agency, but I want to argue also provide some glimpses of the character of an operative fabric of place. In England, for instance, Anne Power's work on acute deprivation in major cities, Patrick Wright's work on memory and belonging in the deindustrialized Isle of Sheppey, which overwhelmingly voted Brexit, Madeline Bunting's journey through the coastal areas of England, all its stripped out coastal towns in the east and the south coast, and Hugh Bynon and Ray Hudson's work on the anatomy of decline in the northeast coal communities reveals a common pattern here. The studies discover bonds that are tight but not open to the world or economically productive. Their strong family ties and place loyalties are directed towards mourning a lost past of social cohesion and economic vitality. in these places, these broken places in England, the bonds, the research finds, are a way of enduring the injuries of poor housing, failed services, economic decline, and social desperation, not of finding a way through foreclosure. Unlike all the things I said earlier on, these are localities of nativist anger towards long-term economic decline, political neglect, and cultural stigmatization. In the anger lies pride in having once counted for something, with residents steeped in the memory of the mid-20th century past of stable work, functioning services, and functioning public spaces, but also a memory of active civic organization once upon a time alongside or against employer authorities. These places and these studies, I think, have a lot to say to us. What I think these studies uncover is an untimely nostalgia, comfort drawn from a lost time of both people and places offering skills, goods, and culture to the wider world, of not being too bothered by being part of the world, of not being too bothered by having strangers in your vicinity. And I'm saying this because of the nativist feelings that prevail right now in these sorts of places. What they're remembering is a time when actually things were better, when they could look outwards, and it was okay to have the stranger in the community. And this nostalgia at one level is debilitating. It reduces agency. It is reason to hate authority, change, and the foreign. But I think what is remembered proves instructive in terms of what might come next. And this is the availability of an infrastructure of seconded responsibility, responding to power, representing interests, providing services. What is remembered is the presence of a social infrastructure once upon a time in these places, of left behind places, of labor unions, of the existence of women's groups, of community centers, of night classes, of church organizations, of youth clubs, of libraries, of meeting places, and also of public spaces. This, I think, could be one element of the collective unconscious that must be returned to hollowed out places. Another, of course, being the most obvious restoration of public service infrastructures, covering the basic necessities of water, energy, shelter, training, welfare, etc. Here, I think we have evidence from places, of course, that have lost something. Many others, like the slums that I have touched on, don't have such a past for newness to pass through. What is their history other than a history of never having had a network of seconded responsibility? Only the endless present of collaborations within inhabitability to find a way past disabling conditions, the things that Malik Simon talks about. But for them too, the message surely has to be the same for these places, namely that an infrastructure of basic services, civic and public organizations, and shared spaces can help to direct incipients towards surer ends by place taking up more of the strain. That's what I'm trying to argue here. With this, what we might find might emerge a place habit that moves on from Heidegger's nostalgia of idyllic forms of dwelling towards a kind of habitus that Bourdieu wrote about, which in a brilliant recent book by Tony Bennett summarizes as, I quote, of having in place social mechanisms through which the interior is conditioned by the collective heritage. Okay, and part of the collective heritage or the collective unconscious that I've been trying to allude to here in Broken Neighborhoods is an infrastructure of seconded social responsibility plus basic services. How much more time do I have? Okay. So keeping these ideas of place affordances in mind, let's then return to the power differentials of our historic moment that I opened with, to the chances of remaindered life surviving the juggernauts of urban foreclosure. Of course, the simple answer is that the chances are what they are because there is no matching counterforce. It's a game of chance. And that in the inhabitation of place, a more than surrendered life may or may not be possible. But I think this would be too pessimistic a conclusion to end this lecture on. I think there might be potential for more, depending on how power is understood. Recently, the Canadian philosopher Brian Massumi has reworked the term para-institution to acknowledge, and I quote, sustained practices in the register of the micro-political that build upon and enhance each other without institutionalizing themselves. Beyond this might be relevant to your project on transformative change. And what Massumi suggests, he proposes that we should look at all kinds of civic mobilization in the shadows of power, from popular militancy to associational activity, as loose forms of organization that leave behind traces, what he calls a power of relation, with transformative potential that does not evaporate after a moment of organization, but returns, and I quote again, to the mute, silent background operations of technicity, bustling with quasi-chaos. Now, Masumi's meaning is hard to get, at least for me. But I think his novel proposition, hence the term para-institution, is that the micro-political field of autonomous organization acts as a kind of a techne, underlying techne, such that, quote again, in manageable doses, the anarchic element knocks on the door, presenting itself for ingression to reformative effect. In intenser doses, it smashes down the door, breaking through with a history-shaking revolutionary force, carrying a creativity beyond the known bounds of reason. I think we can think of the displays of survivalist defiance in the urban peripheries that I've talked about, defiance against dispossession, as examples of just this kind of para-institutional technicity, which is anchored in the collective habits, and they are collective habits, not individual habits, of make-shift, of ecological familiarity, and of aesthetic autonomy. A technicity in the sense of intelligences, artifacts, and dispositions acting as the bearers of durational time. And of course, lived space as well. And micro-political in the sense of power in the mute, in the silent background, from time to time borrowed in somebody else's revolutionary games, but in the main, just making its own call and response. And of course, we can't be dewy-eyed, we can't be fanciful about this, because remainder places, let's not forget, have their own overlords caught up in the politics of foreclosure. Let's just take one example. Strong young men from the hood are becoming the marshals of the far right's nativist war of hate against migrants and minorities. In this role, they have put at risk also the delicate balance of intersectional tolerance within popular neighborhoods by playing up the sectarian animosities of criminal gangs, powerful families, and political thugs. Just look at the encroachments of the BJP in the slums of India, spewing out bile against Dalits and Muslims and liberal democracy. Look at the violence of coalitions of angry residents and far-right agitators in left-behind places across Europe, targeting mosques and asylum centers and multiculturalism. Yet, as we have seen, behind such malice persists another demand, in my view, a more affirmative one that from time to time erupts in the sense intended by Masumi. I'm thinking of the student mobilization that ousted the Hasina regime in Bangladesh for too long serving only its own. I'm thinking of the street invasions now in Nairobi and Accra against rampant inflation. Let's not forget what's going on in Serbia. I'm thinking of the mass occupations in 2020 in India against discriminatory new legislation on citizenship, and the vocal pushback just last summer after Labour came into power in the English towns against racist demonstrations by the far right. There is resistance, there is opposition. And as the direction of formal politics becomes more and more one-sided, the street, virtual and real, I think is returning as the stage of affective politics, the place of popular expression of what and for whom the city and nation are for, the battleground of competing anarchist tendencies. The balance of force, of course, is uneven, with nastiness sustained by the shock troops of the far right, populist influences and opportunist media and business oligarchs, while the protests for decency forever wait for the might of law and government and political leadership and narratives of the open society to offer some degree of backing. But there is no backing. I think that's the kind of obvious truth today. There is no backing. Or when there is a stir, it is still with some kind of liberal ambivalence towards migrants and minorities and the masses who live in the urban peripheries. The promises of shelter, work, and welfare for the left behind are still very much on hold. So there is little likelihood of any kind of harness from the macro institutions of liberal politics anytime soon, which is what I'm trying to say. But the demand for urban justice, I think, remains, as does latency in the urban shadows. Perhaps then, following Masumi, the harness must be, and can only be, in this particular contingent moment, it must be para-institutional, a gathering up of tendencies of co-fabrication and coexistence brought into the frame, into our optic through the word image, through aesthetic and infrastructural amplifications of the kind that I've suggested, pressuring the macro-political, fingers crossed, to move with it. And there are historical precedents in similarly one-way times, such as the tradition of civil disobedience in the demand for social and political rights, of refusal in the struggle for gender, racial, and anti-colonial recognition, of occupation in the making of alternative housing, of the social and circular economy to enable cooperative ways of making a living, of elective communities escaping from the rat race. This is a tradition that never died. It has never died, and one that could make more of the living archive of autonomous organization in remaindered places. Reflecting on the colonial and post-colonial African condition of, and I quote, of being nothing, of always being available, of being the sucker in the farce, Abdurrahman Sek reminds us how in this condition of being forever obligated, being is already to be in the midst of sharing, of already participating in sharing, not to simply reside in a solitary crowd in post-colonial Africa. It comes with the practical perimeter of sense, that is the ability to sit down together, in other words, to be capable of cultivating sociality. The task Abdurrahman Sek proposes is, I quote again, to transform everyday tools and forms of knowledge into legitimate and equitable political resources that express social ties that are largely held by everyone. We might want to think of the remaindered urban in exactly the same way. Its generative responses to foreclosure, its untimely incipience, prefigurative of another urbanism in this very suffocating political moment. Thank you.